الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الله الرحمن الرحيم. ولا تقولوا لما تصف ألسنتكم الكذب هذا حلال وهذا حرام لتفتروا على الله الكذب. إن الذين يفترون على الله الكذب لا يفلحون. متاع قليل ولهم عذاب أليم. وعلى الذين هادوا حرمنا ما قصصنا عليك من قبل وما ظلمناهم ولكن كانوا أنفسهم يظلمون. ثم إن ربك للذين عملوا السوء بجهالة ثم تابوا من بعد ذلك وأصلحوا إن ربك من بعدها لغفور رحيم. إن إبراهيم إبراهيم كان أمة إن إبراهيم كان أمة قانتا لله حنيفا ولم يك من المشركين شاكرا لأنعمه اجتباه وهداه إلى صراط مستقيم وآتيناه في الدنيا حسنة وإنه في الآخرة لمن الصالحين ثم أوحينا إليك أن اتبع ملة إبراهيم حنيفا وما كان من المشركين إنما جعل السبت على الذين اختلفوا فيه وإن ربك ليحكم بينهم يوم القيامة فيما كانوا فيه يختلفون ادع إلى سبيل ربك بالحكمة والموعظة الحسنة وجادلهم بالتي هي أحسن إن ربك هو أعلم بمن ضل عن سبيله وهو أعلم بالمهتدين ادع إلى سبيل ربك بالحكمة والموعظة الحسنة وجادلهم بالتي هي أحسن إن ربك هو أعلم بمن ضل عن سبيله وهو أعلم بالمهتدين. وإن عاقبتم فعاقبوا بمثل ما عوقبتم به ولئن صبرتم لهو خير للصابرين. واصبر وما صبرك إلا بالله ولا تحزن عليهم ولا تك في ضيق مما يمكرون. واصبر وما صبرك إلا بالله ولا تحزن عليهم ولا تك في ضيق مما يمكرون. إن الله مع الذين اتقوا والذين هم محسنون. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
الزهراء عليها السلام بنت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم قال: سمعت فاطمة أنها قالت: دخل علي أبي رسول الله في بعض الأيام فقال: السلام عليك يا فاطمة. فقلت: عليك السلام. قال: إني أجد في بدني ضعفا. فقلت له: أعيذك بالله يا أبتاه من الضعف. فقال: يا فاطمة ائتيني بالكساء اليماني فغطيني به. فأتيته بالكساء اليماني فغطيته به وصرت أنظر إليه وإذا وجهه يتلألأ كأنه البدر في ليلة تمامه وكماله، فما كانت إلا ساعة وإذا بولد الحسن قد أقبل وقال: السلام عليك يا أماه. فقلت: وعليك السلام يا قرة عيني وثمرة فؤادي. فقال: يا أماه إني أشم عندك رائحة طيبة كأنها رائحة جدي رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم. فقلت نعم إن جدك تحت الكساء. فأقبل الحسن نحو الكساء وقال السلام عليك يا جداه يا رسول الله، أتأذن لي أن أدخل معك تحت الكساء؟ فقال وعليك السلام يا ولدي ويا صاحب حوضي، قد أذنت لك. فدخل معه تحت الكساء، فما كانت إلا ساعة وإذا بولد الحسين عليه السلام قد أقبل وقال السلام عليك يا أمه. فقلت وعليك السلام يا ولدي ويا قرة عيني وثمرة فؤادي. فقال لي يا أماه إني أشم عندك رائحة طيبة كأنها رائحة جدي رسول الله. فقلت نعم إن جدك وأخاك تحت الكساء. فدنا الحسين نحو الكساء وقال السلام عليك يا جداه، السلام عليك يا من اختاره الله، أتأذن لي أن أكون معكما تحت الكساء؟ فقال وعليك السلام يا ولدي وشافع أمتي، قد أذنت لك. فدخل معهما تحت الكساء، فأقبل عند ذلك أبو الحسن علي بن أبي طالب وقال السلام عليك يا بنت رسول الله. فقلت وعليك السلام يا أبا الحسن ويا أمير المؤمنين. فقال يا فاطمة إني أشم عندك رائحة طيبة كأنها رائحة أخي وابن عمي رسول الله. فقلت نعم ها هو مع ولديك تحت الكساء. فأقبل علي نحو الكساء وقال السلام عليك يا رسول الله، أتأذن لي أن أكون معكم تحت الكساء؟ قال له وعليك السلام يا أخي ويا وصي وخليفتي وصاحب لوائي، قد أذنت لك. فدخل علي تحت الكساء، ثم أتيت نحو الكساء وقلت السلام عليك يا أبتاه يا رسول الله، أتأذن لي أن أكون معكم تحت الكساء؟ قال وعليك السلام يا ابنتي ويا بضعتي، قد أذنت لك. فدخلت تحت الكساء فلما اكتملنا جميعا تحت الكساء أخذ أبي رسول الله بطرفي الكساء وأومأ بيده اليمنى إلى السماء وقال اللهم إن هؤلاء أهل بيتي وخاصتي وحامتي لحمهم لحمي ودمهم دمي يؤلمني ما يؤلمهم ويحزنني ما يحزنهم أنا حرب لمن حاربهم وسلم لمن سالمهم وعدو لمن عاداهم ومحب لمن أحبهم إنهم مني وأنا منهم فاجعل صلواتك وبركاتك ورحمتك وغفرانك ورضوانك علي وعليهم وأذهب عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. فقال الله عز وجل يا ملائكتي ويا سكان سماواتي إني ما خلقت سماء مبنيا ولا أرضا مدحيا ولا قمرا منيرا ولا شمسا مضيئا ولا فلكا يدور ولا بحرا يجري ولا فلكا يسري إلا في محبة هؤلاء الخمسة الذين هم تحت الكساء. فقال الأمين جبرائيل يا رب ومن تحت الكساء؟ فقال عز وجل هم أهل بيت النبوة ومعدن الرسالة هم فاطمة وأبوها وبعلها وبنوها. فقال جبرائيل يا رب أتأذن لي أن أهبط إلى الأرض لأكون معهم سادسا؟ فقال الله نعم قد أذنت لك. فهبط الأمين جبرائيل وقال السلام عليك يا رسول الله العلي الأعلى يقرئك السلام ويخصك بالتحية والإكرام ويقول لك وعزتي وجلالي إني ما خلقت سماء مبنية ولا أرضا مدحية ولا قمرا منيرا ولا شمسا مضيئا ولا فلكا يدور ولا بحرا يجري ولا فلكا يسري إلا لأجلكم ومحبتكم. وقد أذن لي أن أدخل معكم فهل تأذن لي يا رسول الله؟ فقال رسول الله وعليك السلام يا أمين وحي الله إنه نعم قد أذنت لك. فدخل جبرائيل معنا تحت الكساء فقال لأبي إن الله قد أوحى إليكم يقول إنما يريد الله ليذهب عنكم الرجس أهل البيت ويطهركم تطهيرا. فقال علي لأبي يا رسول الله أخبرني ما لجلوسنا هذا تحت الكساء من الفضل عند الله. فقال النبي صلى الله عليه وآله والذي بعثني بالحق نبيا واصطفاني بالرسالة نجيا ما ذكر خبرنا هذا في محفل من محافل أهل الأرض وفيه جمع من شيعتنا ومحبينا إلا ونزلت عليهم الرحمة وحفت بهم الملائكة واستغفرت لهم إلى أن يتفرقوا. فقال علي عليه السلام إذن والله فزنا وفاز شيعتنا ورب الكعبة. فقال أبي رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله يا علي والذي بعثني بالحق نبيا واصطفاني بالرسالة نجيا ما ذكر خبرنا هذا في محفل من محافل أهل الأرض وفيه جمع من شيعتنا ومحبينا وفيهم مهموم إلا وفرج الله همه ولا مغموم إلا وكشف الله غمه ولا طالب حاجة إلا وقضى الله حاجته. فقال علي عليه السلام إذن والله فزنا وسعدنا وكذلك شيعتنا فازوا وسعدوا في الدنيا والآخرة ورب الكعبة.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We welcome you to the fourth series of 5 Majlis. Today's topic is Islamic political system, priorities and policies in the post-Ghaiba period. We will be enlightened more on this topic by Sheikh Sulayman Hassan. We would like to commence the program with Marcia, followed by a brief introduction of today's topic, and then the Majalis itself. After the Majalis, we will have the Noha, followed by a Q&A session for questions our audience might have. You can send the questions to the link that was sent to you or to the Facebook page of Shahe Najaf. Now, I would like to invite Brother Jafar Raza to recite Marcia. He will be joining us from Houston. Salawat.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum to everyone watching us right now. There's a Marcia in relation to the Children of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, originally written by Mirza Dabir. Muhammad wa ali Muhammad salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad wa ajal faraj. چہلم جو کربلا میں 72 کا ہو چکا، چہلم جو کربلا میں 72 کا ہو چکا، پیوند بے کسوں کے تنو سر کا ہو چکا، اور فاتحہ حسین کے لشکر کا ہو چکا، قبروں پر شور آل پیمبر کا ہو چکا، قبروں پر شور آل پیمبر کا ہو چکا، ماتم میں 3 روز رہے شور و شین سے، ارے روئے لپٹ کے مزار حسین سے، مثل چراغ گورے غریباں پہ دل جلائے، پھولوں کے بدلے قبروں پہ لختے جگر چڑھائے، ہر پیاسوں کی بود و باش کے سامان جو یاد آئے، بے ساختہ پکارے کلیجا پکڑ کے ہائے، کنبے کے ساتھ داخلہ کربلا ہوا، لایا جو تھا مدینے سے ہم کو، وہ کیا ہوا، لایا جو تھا مدینے سے ہم کو، وہ کیا ہوا، ارے آئے تھے کس طرح سے وطن کے، اس طرح چلے، نہ شہر رہے نہ گودیوں میں گود کے پلے، سوتے تھے قبر میں جو کٹائے ہوئے گلے، یہ وقت وہ تھا پھرتے تھے سب آنکھ کے تلے، عابد سے بانو کہتی تھی مہلت قلیل ہے، کچھ خاک پاک لے لو کہ صغرا علیل ہے، اے کربلا سرور دلگیر الوداع، اے قتل گاہ حضرت شبیر الوداع، اے قتل گاہ حضرت شبیر الوداع، اے قبر ابن صاحب تطہیر الوداع، اے بھائی جان جاتی ہے ہم شیر الوداع، کیا غم نصیب ہے یہ نواسی رسول کی، ارے تم نے مجاوری نہ ہماری قبول کی، تم نے مجاوری نہ ہمارے قبول کی، چہلم جو کربلا میں، صلوات بر محمد و آل محمد.
Jazakallah.
Jazakumullah.
Just a brief introduction to the topic, and then Sayyid would elaborate more on today's topic that we have. While Shia Muslims have a clear view that political authority should have been given to the infallible Imams while they were present in the community, there are many questions on what the political system should be in the period of the 12th Imam's ghaiba. We see both diversity of models and a diversity of opinions among jurists. And then there seems to be pros and cons to each model. More importantly, there is a need to understand what the responsibility is of Shia Muslims living in the United States and in other countries where they are a minority or a minority within a minority. The political context changes quite dramatically as we move from US to India to Pakistan to Lebanon to Bahrain to Saudi. Now we will invite Sayyid Agha Sulayman to share his wisdom on this topic. Salawat.
Jazakumullah. And thank you for very beautiful recitation of Marcia and introduction to the topic. Let us begin with Surah Al-Fatiha for the marhumin of the sponsors and all of those present today in this majlis. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen Ar-Rahmanir Rahim Maliki Yawmiddin Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين فاطر السماوات والأرضين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد، اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الأطيبين الأطهرين الهداة المهديين، ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, in today's majlis, like we have done in the past, we will briefly introduce a topic and speak about some of the top level general principles that we learn from Islam, so that we can then use the discussion period and the question answer period to examine specific applications and implications of those Islamic principles. But we need to develop an Islamic framework, an approach to understanding politics and our political responsibilities and participation in order to be able to then deal with those specific questions. So during this majlis, we're not going to examine whether the number of Supreme Court justices should be 9 or 13, or even if there should be a Supreme Court, but rather the general principles that Islam teaches us about the nature and the role of politics within our individual life and within our collective life. I would like to begin with an examination of a common question that people ask, these days, because the area we know of as the Middle East, Western Asia, and the heartland of Islam is very much in the news and part of politics. There is warfare, there is a refugee crisis, there is economic and social and political upheaval. So everybody has heard about Iraq, about Syria, about Lebanon, and many people have heard about Sunni and Shia. And if you study Islam in many college courses, if you are introduced to Islam in the media, and even many Muslims who acquire their understanding of Islam from these secular sources or these non-authoritative sources, they believe that the difference between Sunni and Shi'i Islam is that Sunnis are in favor of democracy and popular participation in politics, and Shi'i Muslims are in favor of a form of a monarchy or a form of a hereditary leadership and rulership. The Sunnis believe that there should be shura, and the Shia believe that there should be the authority of the family of Prophet Muhammad and the descendants of Prophet Muhammad. So first Imam Ali, and then the 11 Imams from the descendants of Imam Ali and Lady Fatima Zahra salamullahi alayha. And so there is an impression among many people, Muslim and non-Muslim, that the difference between Sunni and Shi'i Islam is that Sunni Islam is democratic or is popular, and Shi'i Islam is monarchist or is legitimist or something of that nature. And the first point that I would like to make is that this is a misunderstanding of the nature of the dispute between Sunni and Shi'i Muslims and the nature of Shi'i Islam in particular. And I do not claim to speak authoritatively about Sunni Islam, but I do hope to explain the nature of Shi'i Islam. And that is that in reality for the Shi'i Muslims, the question of the succession to Prophet Muhammad is a question of the succession of prophethood and the nature of prophethood and the nature of Islam and Tawheed. It's not a political question. And Prophet Muhammad's prophethood and his message and his effect on society was not a political or primarily a political effect. And therefore, when we speak of the succession of prophethood and the succession of the mission of Prophet Muhammad, we're not speaking in political terms. The disagreement that the Shi'i Muslims have with other schools of thought within Islam is not whether the political leader of the Muslims should be chosen by selection or by election or by a limited consultation or by heredity. The difference between the Shi'i Muslims and other Muslims is that the message of Prophet Muhammad which was an all-encompassing message and which was rooted in authentic knowledge and guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, did not come to a close with the close of the Prophet's life, with the end of prophecy, with the end of revelation, but authentic knowledge of that revelation, authentic knowledge of that scripture which is in the Quran, the unadulterated and the authentic and genuine understanding of the revelation continued after the death of Prophet Muhammad and therefore the message of Islam in its religious and spiritual and intellectual terms did not come to an end. In other words, Prophet Muhammad had an effect for society on their social relationships. Prophet Muhammad defined marriage and the laws of marriage, defined certain economic rules about how we are to conduct our business, what we are to prioritize, how our money is to be inherited, khums, zakat, sadaqah, and all of these other obligations. But Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was not an economist. And the nature of his message was not an economic message. He defined our marriages, our family relationships and inheritance, but he was not primarily a legislator of personal status law or a social reformer. And similarly, every other area, including politics, that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ gave us guidance for, this is a part and parcel of his message, but this is not the nature of his message. So Shi'i Islam is the school of thought that believes that when Prophet Muhammad ﷺ primarily was a spiritual guide and teacher and a trainer for humanity to bring us to salvation, to lift us from a material existence to a higher level of existence, which allows us to be worthy of the grace of Allah and salvation. The question is, did this process of spiritual guidance based on authentic and true understanding of scripture come to an end with Prophet Muhammad, and after that it is just a matter of ijtihad and scholarship and guesswork? Or did it not come to an end and it continued through Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam, such that when Imam Ali answers the question of a mu'min about law, about the interpretation of the Quran, about theology, about ethics, or about politics or economy or society or any other subject, is Imam Ali like the other companions, like the other ulama, like the other fuqaha of the ummah in his time or afterwards? Is Imam Ali alayhi salam giving us his best guess and his best answer? Or is he giving us the right answer and the genuine understanding of Islam? Shi'i Muslim says that his answer is not like the answer that a faqih gives, an alim gives, that I might give, or somebody else who has studied Islam might give. Imam Ali is not telling you what his best guess or understanding of Islam is. He is telling you exactly what Prophet Muhammad would tell you if Prophet Muhammad were alive and amongst us. He does not have new revelation. There is no new verse of Quran, there is no new law of Islam that is being revealed, but he is properly explaining the implementation, the meaning, the interpretation of that revelation for humanity. So this is not a question of, is the political selection to be done by heredity or to be done by democracy or consultation. That's not the question at all. The question is that God has preserved authentic knowledge of revelation after Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Not new revelation. There is no prophet after Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but there is a person who has the access to the full message of the Prophet and the proper implementation and explanation of the message of the Prophet, and who can then convey that to the Muslim Ummah, and that is Ahlul Bayt. And because Allah chose for this to be within the family of the Prophet, we say that the Imams are from the family of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But we don't believe they are Imams because they are the family of the Prophet. We believe they are from the family of the Prophet because Allah chose those people to be the Imam. Meaning it is their worthiness and their qualification for the role, and the fact that they were appointed by Allah and appointed by Prophet Muhammad under the command of Allah. That is why we believe in them as the Imam. But it was the Sunnah of the Prophet that in the previous nations and in our religious community, Allah chose people from within the family of the Prophet, from within the family of the previous Imam. And this is one form of mercy to the Ummah, to make it easier for us to recognize and to follow and to develop a relationship with the Imam. So this is the nature of the disagreement that exists within the Muslim world about the leadership after the Prophet. It is not a question of economic decision making or political decision making. It is a question of the nature of guidance and knowledge after the departure of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ from this physical existence amongst us as his community. Those who are not Shi'i Muslims, they believe that there is nobody who has the complete interpretation of the Quran, the complete answer to a legal question or a theological question. Everybody in the Ummah is to make their best guess, and if they guess right and they do a valid ijtihad, a correct ijtihad, then they get a reward from Allah, a double reward for making the effort and for getting the right answer. And if they make a mistake, they get a single reward for making the effort, even if the answer they get is not correct. So for them, there is nobody who has the right answer. And therefore, what comes to the forefront within Islam is the social and the political, and then the human and imperfect intellectual tradition that is preserved by fuqaha and ulama and scholars within the Muslim ummah. So this is where the prominence of politics comes. Another way to say the same principle is that for the Shi'i Muslims, the nature of Islam is to raise politics above politics and to make it something that reflects the spirituality and the values that we as Muslims are to believe in and are to implement. Whereas we don't have that same level of idealism or effort to understand politics in spiritual terms and in principle terms among the general Muslim community. There is a more pragmatic approach that in the end people have different views and there are various competing people who could be the leaders of the Muslim Ummah. We have to find somebody, so let's go ahead and obey the Caliph. At least we'll have stability, and we will have an army, and we will have defense, and we will have conquests, which were known as the Futuhat, and the affairs of the Muslim Ummah will continue. So this is the nature of that dispute. And this also answers for us the question then of what is the job of the Imam when it comes to politics. The job of the Imam is to be the guide to the Muslim Ummah, to tell us how do we obey the command of Allah in the political sphere. In other words, politics is just like any other sphere. I don't believe that, for example, in a modern, sophisticated economy, that if Imam Ali were present today, or inshallah, if the Imam of our time returns in our lifetime and we are able to see the success of the mission of our Imam, we don't believe that if there is going to be a national bank, that the Imam or the Ma'asum is going to be the chairman of the Federal Reserve and is going to be setting the policy necessarily. We don't necessarily believe that if the Imam is going to have an army for national defense, that the Imam is going to be the commander-in-chief, or the Imam will be the commander-in-chief, but we don't believe the Imam is going to be the army chief for the national defense forces or the Islamic defense forces. If Imam is going to have educational policy, then it doesn't mean that the Imam will also serve as the Secretary of the Interior or the Secretary of Education or the Secretary of Homeland Security and so on. The job of the Imam, the role of the Imam is to explain to people what are the principles of Islam. The Imam might have somebody who is to serve as the chief of the central bank. The Imam may have somebody who is going to serve as the army chief. The Imam may have somebody who is going to serve as the education secretary. But each of those cabinet officials, each of those ministers, each of those officials or executives, they will base their actions on the guidance derived from revelation and not from personal opinion that they receive from the Imam. That is the role of the Imam. And there might very well be a case where the Imam says, no, this is a job that I am only able to fulfill and nobody else can fulfill it. So the Imam himself may lead Eid prayer. He may lead Friday prayer. He may himself serve as the chief executive of the society and the state that he creates. He may himself serve as the chief official of the judiciary. But the point is that the job of the Imam is to determine what principles that society is to be governed by, what are the divine values that are able to bring human beings as individuals, as a community, to success and to salvation. As part of that role, if the Imam says that this is a job that I am to fulfill and nobody else can fulfill it, then the Imam himself may lead a particular branch of government. He may himself command the armed forces and lead them into battle, or the Imam may appoint somebody to do that, or the Imam might set up a process and say that you are to choose among yourselves somebody who can serve as the Surgeon General, who can serve as the Attorney General, who can serve as the Secretary of Education, but they are to have these qualifications because this is the structure, these are the principles that Islam has taught us in order to accomplish the goals that Allah has for our society and for our political unit. So the role of the Imam is to create consensus on the basis of a spiritual truth. The job of the Imam is not just to be an executive. And in fact, those Muslims who put too much emphasis on the implementation and on the execution and on that apparent khilafah, in reality what they lost is they lost that reminder that the question is first and foremost, what are the principles by which society should operate? That comes first. That is the lasting question that we need to have a good answer to. And then if you have a good executive in a bad system, eventually that executive, him or herself, and then the entire system will be corrupted. But if you have a good system, then eventually it will create good executives and good officials within itself. That is the importance of a solid foundation and the right foundation. So Ahlul Bayt's religion was a religion that taught that the understanding of what our choices are to be, what is the right course of action, what are the priorities we have, this must come from Ahlul Bayt. This must come from a source that is connected to true knowledge from Allah. And then the implementation comes afterwards. And once again, the Imam may implement directly or the Imam may implement indirectly. That is up to the Imam, and in every context, in every society, the Imam will explain whose hands the execution and the implementation of a particular part of the Islamic message should proceed through. Let's look at a few verses of Quran that will explain this principle in a little bit more detail, inshallah, and make it clear exactly what we are referring to. But before we do that, just a historical and somewhat ironic point I would like to mention, which is that when people say that Ahlul Bayt ﷺ and their followers, they believe in a leadership that comes not through democracy and people's selection, but that comes through heredity or divine appointment, and the remainder of the Muslims, they believe in the importance of shura and popular participation. Ironically, in the entire 1400-year history of Islam and the long history of this institution known as the Khilafat, there are only two times when you had popular participation in the decision to choose the leader of the Muslim Ummah. And both times it was the Shia Imam. First time was Imam Ali alayhi salam after the death of Caliph Uthman. The second time was Imam Hassan alayhi salam after the death of Imam Ali alayhi salam. These were the two times in all of Islamic history, neither the Khilafah Rashida, nor the Khilafah of Banu Umayyah, nor the Khilafah of Banu Abbas, nor the Khilafah of the Uthmaniyya, the Ottomans. In none of those cases was there even a single incident where, or a single example, where there was a shura that was conducted. As you know, Abu Bakr, the first caliph, was chosen in Saqifa by a very small group of people. It wasn't the majority of companions or Ansar even, or even the members of Quraysh who had a role. This is a matter of consensus that not a single member of Banu Hashim was even present or asked. The first and earliest Muslims, they had no share. So there was no shura for the first caliph. There was no shura for the second caliph. There was no shura for the third caliph. There was no shura for any of the members of Banu Umayyah. There was no shura for any of the members of Banu Abbas, and so on until the present time. 2 times there was a shura, and that was Imam Ali alayhi salam, who had spent 25 years before the death of Uthman telling the Muslim Ummah that I am the rightful successor to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This was the right of Ahlul Bayt that you have taken. When Uthman was killed, people came to Imam Ali. He said that I am not going to accept, now you have committed so much corruption in the name of Islam that it is going to be difficult to be fixed. When people insisted, then Imam Ali took the Pledge of Allegiance from people in public, and after people had a chance to deliberate and to willingly come and say that there is nobody in the Muslim Ummah who can unite the community and right the wrongs that have been committed, except Imam Ali alayhi salatu wassalam. So this was the first of 2 shura and consultations among the Muslims at large that existed in Islam. And the second one was Imam Hassan alayhi salam. And this is a point that many people are not aware of. When one of the prominent scholars of the 20th century in Sunni Islam, Sayyid Abu Ala Maududi, wrote a book called Khilafatu Mulukiyat, the Caliphate and Monarchy as existed in Islamic history. He contributed this reminder to people that it was Muawiyah who was the originator of monarchy within Islam, because he appointed his son Yazid to be caliph with the disastrous consequences that all of us are familiar with. Why did he not point to Imam Ali when Imam Ali had also appointed Imam Hassan to be his successor? From a Shia perspective, of course, this makes sense. Imam Hassan was appointed as the second Imam. But for a Sunni scholar, Sayyid Abu Ala Maududi, why would he not say that Imam Ali's appointment of Imam Hassan was the first example of hereditary rule and monarchy? Why did he say that Muawiyah's appointment of Yazid was the first example? One answer, of course, is that Imam Hassan was eminently qualified, even according to the standards of the general Muslim community, let alone the standards of Ahlul Bayt themselves. The second answer, however, is that Imam Ali also appointed Imam Hassan as his wasi. But after the death of Imam Ali, it was Imam Hassan and Abdullah ibn Abbas who went to the Masjid of Kufa and then asked the people, this was the will of your Imam, do you wish to pledge allegiance or not? Do you obey the command of Allah and the command of your Imam or not? And so people pledged allegiance willingly to Imam Hassan of their own free accord. There was no done deal that had been imposed by Imam Ali or by Imam Hassan on the Muslims. So Imam Ali and Imam Hassan, both of them were the only 2 people in Islamic history who gave a shura. The belief from our Shi'i perspective is that they were the Imam. And then as the Imam, they offered people a choice. That do you wish to follow and obey and fulfill your responsibility or not? So the spiritual context of that political choice is to be decreed by the Imam in accordance with the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then the implementation of that is based on the command of the Imam. So with that understanding, let's look at these 2 verses or 2 stories mentioned in the Quran. One is in Surah Al-Baqarah, where it is said that after the time of Prophet Musa, there was a group of Bani Israel, al-Mala' min Bani Israel. They came to a prophet, قَالُوا لِنَبِيٍّ لَهُمْ, a prophet among the prophets of Bani Israel. The Quran does not name who that prophet was. And they said to their prophet, إِبْعَثْ لَنَا مَلِكًا, give us a king. So the prophet's job was then to determine who should be a king. But the prophet himself, although he was the messenger of Allah, He was the one who received revelation. He did not become the king, neither did Bani Israel ask for him to be the king, nor did he say that now that you have come and asked for Allah to give you a ruler or a king, it is going to be me. The job of the Prophet is to explain the standard for leadership. So they were right to come to the Nabi and not just to say that we're going to decide for ourselves. This is not a religious affair. This is a secular affair. That was the right question to ask, the right person to ask the question, and then it is the duty of the Prophet to explain that is he the one who is going to assume leadership, or is he going to appoint somebody, or is he going to determine a structure for that decision to be made. So when they came to their Prophet, they said that we would like to have a king so that we can defend our rights, nuqatil fi sabilillah, we can live up to our duty to Allah. The Prophets first asked them, are you going to fulfill? They said that we will fulfill. And then the story continues that قَالَ لَهُمْ نَبِيُّهُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ قَدْ بَعَثَ لَكُمْ طَالُوتَ مَلِكًا. Allah has made Talut, or Saul, he has made Talut to be your king. So this was the command of Allah revealed through the Prophet. The Prophet was the means by which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala conveyed the command. The Prophet himself did not assume leadership. Now the people of Israel, they objected. قَالُوا وَأَنَّا يَكُونُ لَهُ الْمُلْكُ عَلَيْنَا وَنَحْنُ أَحَقُّ بِالْمُلْكِ مِنْهُ وَلَمْ يُؤْتَ سَعَةً مِنَ الْمَالِ. How can he be the king over us when we have more right, which should have been one of us that you appointed? And specifically they said, وَلَمْ يُؤْتَ سَعَةً مِنَ الْمَالِ. He has not been given a lot of wealth. So, every society, they have a certain expectation of what is required for a political ruler. Sometimes, even in our own elections, they say that a person with a business experience and executive experience will do a good job. In other cases, there might be other priorities that a generation of people has or a society has. Military background, experience in an executive capacity, or other requirements. In the case of Banu Israel, one of the things that they thought was important was sa'atam min al-mal, to be wealthy. Because you know how to manage money, you're not going to be all of a sudden overwhelmed when you see how much money comes into the treasury, so you'll be able to manage it and be able to govern the affairs of society. They thought that was an important qualification. This is what their Prophet said, that no, you were wrong. The qualification for a Nabi is not to be wealthy. The qualification is قَالَ إِنَّ اللَّهَ اصْطَفَاهُ عَلَيْكُمْ. Allah chose Talut to be your king. وَزَادَهُ بَسْطَةً فِي الْعِلْمِ وَالْجِسْمِ. Allah has given him knowledge and Allah has given him strength. These are the qualifications that are needed, and this is the person who has these qualifications. You need to have knowledge in order to be able to rule justly and with wisdom. You need to be able to have strength in order to defend your community against evildoers and aggressors from within, and external enemies from without. Wallahu yu'ti mulkahu man yasha. Allah gives this authority to whomever He wills. Wallahu wasi'un alim. And we cannot limit ourselves or limit Allah to our understanding. Allah is wasi', He is expansive, and He has knowledge. So this verse tells us the historical example in the time of Bani Israel for the principle that I mentioned earlier. The job of the Nabi in this case, or the job of the Imam in our Ummah, is to set the terms of our social, our economic, our legal, our civic, our political participation. As a Muslim, what are the values that you should uphold? What are the priorities that you should uphold? And this might change in different times. So in one society, based on how homogeneous the society is, based on their level of education, based on their geography, the Imam might say that we need to have a very centralized system of government. In another case, the Imam might say that we need to have a federal system of government and decentralization of decision making. In a tribal society, the specific structures and mechanisms the Imam may use will be different, perhaps, than an urban society or a highly industrialized or educated society. The point from the Shi'i perspective is not that there is one form of government, there is one right answer to the role of the military within society, the role of various other civic institutions, the degree of centralization within society, the separation of powers. These are not the first order questions that Islam has a single and unchanging answer to. The flexibility and the dynamism of the Islamic system is rooted in the fact that it is the Imam, the Ma'asum, who has the right knowledge from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of the right balance. And therefore, a true Islamic government is one that is founded on the principles given by the Ma'asum. And that will reflect the highest interests of the Muslim community and of humanity as revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and as executed and implemented by the Imam. The specific structures and mechanisms may change in different times and in different places and in different contexts based on what is best for humanity at that time and what humanity is able to accomplish. In the time of Banu Israel, when the people came and said they wanted a king, then the Prophet appointed a king based on the standard that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed is the right answer. So this is one example that we have from the Quran. The other example, which I will mention more briefly, is the example mentioned, I believe, in Surah al-A'raf, which is when Prophet Musa alayhi salam was sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for a divine appointment, and it was originally 30 days extended by 10 days. And there was a 40-day then miqat, or appointment, that Musa alayhi salam had to receive the revelation from Allah. During that time, Prophet Musa had appointed his heir, wazir, successor Harun, who was also a prophet and was ma'asum, to be the leader of Banu Israel. During that time, Bani Israel, they abandoned not just salat, not just some of the superficial or the individual obligations of Islam, of their religion, but they abandoned Tawheed itself, the most important principle of Islam, the most important principle of religion. And Harun was in charge of the Ummah at that time. And he did not fight against those who had begun that bid'ah. And so when Prophet Musa alayhi salam returned, coming with a revelation from Allah, Allah had honored Prophet Musa, Allah had honored Banu Israel with the Torah, and he saw that now his community, rather than waiting for him and receiving the Torah and then committing to implement it and to spread those pure teachings among the other nations of the world, they were worshipping idols. They had followed the polytheists in the neighboring communities in their misguidance, rather than being ready to convey the guidance that Allah had revealed to them and through them to other human beings. So Prophet Musa alayhi salam was upset. And then, as the Quran says, أَخَذَ بِرَأْسِ أَخِيهِ يَجُرُّهُ إِلَيْهِ, he took Harun alayhi salam by the beard and pulled him towards him. And this was not a mistake. This was not anger of Musa alayhi salam overacting. This was the job of a prophet to show the anger and the wrath that Allah holds for those who knowingly ascribe false partners to Allah. And so that was the initial expression of that divine wrath in the actions of Prophet Musa. But then Harun alayhi salam explained what he did. Qala ibna O my brother, innal qawma istad'afuni. Innal qawma istad'afuni, the people considered me to be weak. Wakadu yaqtulunani, and they were about to kill me. So Prophet Harun said to Prophet Musa that if I were to fight them at that time, then I would have been killed, and there would not have been a single community for you to come back and convey the message of the Torah to. So in the action of Prophet Harun, of course, was, as a prophet, the right action. And Musa alayhi salam also then did not punish Harun, he punished the wrongdoers. What that tells us is that the service that government is to provide sometimes is to establish a right policy in a Muslim society in the time of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, not just for the sake of Tawheed, but even for the sake of the banning of usury and unjust and oppressive interest rates. The Quran says that if you do not accept, this is battle, this is war. Islam will impose a just economic system and prevent people who are wealthy from taking economic advantage of those who are poor or in debt. So in some cases, even if you do not obey the command about interest, then you are going to be at war with Islam and at war with the Prophet. And another case, even if you forget interest, if you abandon Tawheed itself, Prophet Harun did not fight, but he waited for Musa alayhi salam to return. What this story tells us is that we should not look for one specific answer that applies to all times and all places, that this is what Islam says must be enforced. Praying, the requirement of hijab, or the ban on alcohol or gambling, all of these are laws of Islam. They are obligations that we as individuals have, that our society has, but whether they are going to be implemented and when and how they are going to be implemented, this requires wisdom. So far we have said that the system of Islam at its essence is to take politics and depoliticize it, to take politics and put it within a spiritual context, and then our political actions and obligations flow from that spiritual context. So when the Imam is present, or when we're speaking of the time of the Imam, that's now a very clear guidance that we have, and of course it is the Imam who will give us that guidance. But now the question is, what about when the Imam is not there? And this is our concern, because you and I are living in a time when I cannot go to the 12th Imam and say, what is our political obligation? Should I vote? Should I vote for one candidate or another candidate? Should I prioritize economic justice or social justice or anti-war policies, or what are my priorities? When it comes to the post-Ghaibah period, then our job is to try to understand to the best of our abilities what are the best ways that we can advocate for the priorities that Islam has given us: the preservation of life, the preservation of individual rights and religious rights and liberties, the preservation of human dignity and the basic necessities that every human being, regardless of background or religion, is entitled to. What is the best way that I can advocate those principles? Because it is the period of Ghaibah, that means that now there is not going to be a definitive answer. I may have an opinion, and I may say that our political participation should be in one form, and you may have a different opinion, and you may believe that our political participation should be in a different form, that will be more effective in accomplishing those principles of Islam. But we should be open-hearted and broad-minded enough to admit that difference. The nature of being in a period of Ghaibah is that you are not going to have consensus. Consensus does not come from me shutting up your argument or defeating you in a debate. Consensus comes from having genuine and authentic answers, and that can only be the preserve of the Imam. Outside of that, we can have a working consensus. We can have a working relationship. We can have mutual humility and mutual respect. The red lines of Sharia are clear. We should not prioritize power over justice. We should not support any unjust or oppressive policy or government. But when it comes to minimizing harm, when it comes to maximizing social or economic justice, there will be legitimate differences of approach. We should be humble and open-minded and discuss within those red lines of Sharia, and gradually we learn what are the most effective and the best policies through that discussion and debate, and through experience, and even through trial and error. So the focus in the Ghaibah period is not on getting the right answer, that this is the Islamic system. The focus is on understanding what are the priorities of Sharia. In other words, don't focus on what is the most effective mechanism or candidate or party to contribute to. Put your energy and your spiritual focus on understanding what are the priorities. Sometimes the greatest failures are not failures of policy or politics. The greater failures are the failures of imagination. We are concerned about the environment, but we don't realize that the greatest harm to the environment comes not from using plastic straws or plastic bags when we are grocery shopping, but it comes from the existence of a military industrial complex that pollutes the entire world. That is the question of our imagination, what policies we consider and what possibilities we consider to exist within the world. Put your focus on understanding what is important, what are the priorities, and then you will find that you will have insight, and with humility and with open-mindedness, you can participate in society. But now we're not looking for that one right answer, that one right policy. We are looking for the maximization of what is good and constructive, and the minimization of what is harmful or destructive for our fellow believers, for our fellow Muslims, for humanity, and for all of creation. So this is, in summary, what our priorities should be like in the period of the absence of our Imam. Inshallah, we will look in more detail at some of the specific applications of these principles in the discussion period. But when we talk about imagination as the focus of our political participation, we can also appreciate the importance of remembrance of Karbala and the sacrifices of Imam Hussain alayhi salam in the time of the presence of the Imam and in the time of Ghaibah. Because if there is one thing that Karbala represents, it is the reminder that Islam is a spiritual message and not a political or military message. It is that we should not lower our expectations, because when the oppression of Uthman came, many people might have said that, well, if Abu Bakr and Umar made a few mistakes, at least they were better than this. And then when Muawiyah came, people might have said, well, at least Uthman did not openly go against the teachings of the Prophet, so he was better than Muawiyah. And maybe if Imam Hussain had not begun his movement, many people would have said at the time of Yazid that Muawiyah was better than Yazid. Imam Hussein's goal was to awaken the conscience of the Muslims and to remind us that we should not settle and keep on lowering our expectations as circumstances and as political leaders become worse and worse, and say that, well, we're happy with this small percentage of the teachings of Islam, we're happy with this small percentage of what is right. Dedicate yourself to truth. Dedicate yourself to liberation and justice in the teachings of Islam, and then don't be limiting in your possibilities and in your imagination. Trust that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a purpose for humanity, and when He decrees, that full measure of justice and truth will be able to spread all through the world. And so this is why Imam Hussein's movement was defined by his call to the people of Kufa, his call to the Muslims, even on the day of Ashura, such that they would recognize the importance of following and achieving guidance and salvation through Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam. And this is why the tragedy of Karbala is not a human tragedy. We don't mourn just that 72 noble souls lost their lives, or that they were thirsty, or that their children and the family of the Prophet were made captives. We mourn that it was heaven and earth, it was humanity that lost a guide, a leader, a pure soul like Imam Hussain alayhi salam, who told us what is the true nature of our existence and could have guided us to salvation. Imam Hussain alayhi salam stood alone on the day of Ashura, and after all of those martyrs who had dedicated their lives to the service of Islam, they had offered their martyrdom, and their bodies lay on the sand of Karbala, strewn with blood and the sand of Karbala. Imam Hussain looked across the battlefield. He looked at the thousands of enemy soldiers now who were waiting to face as one army just a single Imam Hussain alone. He looked towards the bodies of his companions and followers and the members of his own family who had achieved martyrdom and whose souls were now in heaven waiting for the Imam to join them in the company of Prophet Muhammad and Amir al-Mu'mineen and Imam Hassan al-Mujtaba. The Imam looked towards the tent where his sister Zainab and Kulthum, where his daughter Sakina and the other young members and the orphans and the women of the family of the Prophet and a few of their companions were. And then, as he saw that scene before him in Karbala, the Imam looked towards the horizon, and I can only say the Imam looked across the ages to the generations that came after him and to our own time. And then he said, هل من ناصر ينصرنا لوجه الله هل من ذاب يذب عن حرم رسول الله هل من مغيث يغيثنا لوجه الله. Is there anyone who will come to our aid? Is there anyone who will defend the honor of the family of the Prophet? Is there anyone who will assist our cause? And those were the words of the Imam across the lands and across history. When the bodies of the martyrs heard that call, I can only say that it must have been that their bodies would have answered the Imam, that if Allah gives permission and our soul comes back to our body, we are still ready, as we promised you on the eve of Ashura, that if we are given life 70 times, we will still not hesitate to give our lives and to sacrifice ourselves for you and for your mission, O our Imam. The Imam did not ask them to come back to life. The Imam did not pray for an army of angels or an army of human beings to be present with him in Karbala, but the Imam prayed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the memory of his mission to stay alive. The Imam called us and prayed for us to be loyal and to be true, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us among those who remember the mission of the Imam and live the mission of Imam Hussain alayhi salam in our own lives. Inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون. اللهم صل على محمد.
Jazakallah. I would like to invite Brother Nasir Rizvi, and he will recite Noha. Salawat.
زینب آ گئی بھائی زینب آ گئی بھائی لو زندان شام سے چھٹ کر زینب آ گئی بھائی زینب آ گئی بھائی لو زندان شام سے چھٹ کر اب نہ یہاں سے گھر جائے گی لوٹ کے یہ ماں جائی زینب آ گئی بھائی لو زندان شام سے چھٹ کر بعد تیرے ایسا لوٹا گھر سر پہ نہ چھوڑی ایک کے چادر کھینچ لیا بیمار کا بستر دیتی رہی میں دہائی زینب آ گئی بھائی زینب آ گئی بھائی تو زندان شام سے چھٹ کر تاریکی راستے انجانے دشمن ہر سونے زیتانے کرب و بلا کے بن میں نہ جانے کیسی شام تھی آئی زینب آ گئی بھائی زینب آ گئی بھائی لو شام سے چھٹ کر حسرت تو تھی جانے خواہر دیتے اجازت گر یہ ستم گر میت پر کچھ دیر ٹھہر کر رو لیتی ماں جائی زینب آ گئی بھائی زینب آ گئی بھائی لو زندان شام سے چھٹ کر سر کھولے بے مکنا و چادر آدھا لے گئے ہم کو در در کیا بولوں ایک قدم پر کس کس کی یاد آئی زینب آ گئی بھائی زینب آ گئی بھائی لو زندان شام سے چھٹ کر چلتے چلتے شام جو پہنچے بس مت پوچھو بھیا ہم سے موت تھی بہتر اس جینے سے موت مگر نہ آئی زینب آ گئی بھائی زینب آ گئی بھائی لو زندان شام سے چھٹ کر ہائے میرا بیمار بھتیجا پل پل خون کے آنسو رویا کیا کرتی مجبور تھی بھیا کچھ نہ بہن کر پائی زینب آ گئی بھائی زینب آ گئی بھائی لو زندان شام سے چھٹ کر تیری یاد میں اس دکھیا کے آنسو ایک نہ پل تھمتے تھے کس کو پتا تھا اس صورت سے اس کو ملے گی رہائی زینب آ گئی بھائی زینب آ گئی بھائی لو زندان شام سے چھٹ کر تیری یاد جب آتی تھی وہ روتی تھی چلاتی تھی وہ روز تماچے کھاتی تھی وہ ہائے تیری شیدائی زینب آ گئی بھائی زینب آ گئی بھائی لو زندان شام سے چھٹ کر
Jazakallah. Thank you, Brother Nasir Rizvi, for that beautiful noha. We would now like to begin our Q&A session. So far, the questions we have received, I believe some of the questions have already been addressed by Agha during his lecture. So with my limited knowledge, I've tried to shortlist, and we do have 4 questions now. Would Agha be okay if I do one question at a time, or you want me to have one question at a time? So we'll go with the first question. How the political responsibility of a Shia Muslim vary depending on whether he or she is living in the US, India, Pakistan, Iraq, or Lebanon?
Jazakumullah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So if you notice during the talk, I tried to focus actually, even though our given topic was our obligations in the ghaiba, but I focused mostly on the role of the Imam. Because once we understand the importance and the centrality of the Imam for the full implementation of Islam, then we can better understand our obligation in the ghaibah. Normally, we are impatient with people who disagree with us. Normally, we think that our understanding of the political solution for Muslim disenfranchisement in India or the erosion of civil liberties in America is what I think. I think voting is important. I think voting for one candidate is important. I think establishing a third party is important. Whatever the idea I have is, I think it's so important. Once I understand the importance of the Imam and the centrality of the Imam for an authentic and a complete implementation of Islam, the important lesson, the most important lesson I learn in the ghaibah is humility. I learned to respect somebody who has a different opinion and try to reach consensus. And this was actually the practice of the Ma'sumin themselves. Imam Ali alayhi salam during his imamat, Imam Hassan alayhi salam, the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa alihi during Medina. There's so many examples where they did have power and they could have exercised power, but they didn't do so because they wanted to try to engage people and establish consensus. Hudaybiyah is the best example in the time of the Prophet. The treaty or the truce of Imam Hassan and Muawiyah is another very powerful example. The people of Imam Hassan opposed the truce because they knew they were in a stronger military position. But Imam Hassan alayhi salam was not looking for one military victory, but for the long-term victory. So with that insight, how does our responsibility differ whether we're living in, say, the US or India or Pakistan, Iraq or Lebanon? We have to look at the society we are living in, decide what are the highest priorities of Islam, and how can we most effectively advocate for those highest priorities. In all societies, it is the dignity of all human beings. It is the basic necessities of education, of shelter, of a minimum income, of healthcare for all members of society. It is the advocating the end of oppressive policies and warfare. Now, how can I do that most effectively? This is the point when I should contribute my knowledge, my experience, my expertise, and listen to others, and try to develop gradual consensus, not to impose it on other Muslims, but to help each other learn that we should not just become a member of a secular political party, but we should not be separate from politics. We should participate and engage. So the point of humility, and when you are humble, then you listen. When you are humble, then you are willing to experiment and experience, and you are willing to learn and gain an insight based on your experience and the experience of others. That is the way forward for the Muslim community in different societies. Don't think that your answer or somebody else's answer is authoritative. The authoritative answer is with the Imam of our time. Inshallah, he will teach us. But in our time, we are to maximize what good we can or minimize what harm we are able to do to the best of our ability and understanding.
Beautiful words of wisdom, Sayyid. This brings us to our second question. Iran fights for the Palestinian cause, but is silent on the Uyghur Muslim issue. Is this not double standards? Is some degree of double standards allowed for survival?
That's a very good question. And I'm not an expert on the Uyghur issue, the extent to which it is suppression of separatism, maybe with heavy-handed tactics, the extent to which it is an oppression of a Muslim community and religious rights. So this is something which we have to be careful not to fall into propaganda on either side. People who minimize it and say everything is good in Xinjiang, or people who say that this is the worst case of oppression in the world today. But what we can say is that no, Muslims should not have double standards, but our standards admit that survival is one of our obligations. The survival of our religious community, the survival of our own lives and our property, and the lives and property of our community. These are, it's not a double standard, it is our standard. And so what we have to try to do, and there's no one perfect answer that a non-ma'sum can give, but what we have to try to do is in every situation see how those factors plug in. China has a particular history and certain strengths and weaknesses that come from the system that its culture has created over thousands of years. Some great successes in poverty reduction, and maybe some things that they don't do as well in terms of religious freedom and civil liberties, which other societies may have a better history of. What we need to do as Muslims is see what is the best way that we can advocate for justice, given those differences, those civilizational differences, those geopolitical differences. In the case of Palestine, it was in the presence of the world that a colonial power gave the property of a native indigenous people to colonists. And so there's no ambiguity about what the right course of action is. The right course of action, colonialism has ended everywhere else in the world. It should end in Palestine as well. Jews should have their rights, Christians should have their rights, Muslims should have their rights. But colonialism and a colonially imposed government which disenfranchises indigenous people, that must come to an end. In the case of East Turkestan, as it's called, or Xinjiang, as it's called, the Muslim areas of China, it's not so historically clear. That area has been under Chinese authority in history. It has been independent in history. There are different understandings of how peaceful coexistence can be brought about in that area. So we should stand up and advocate for the cause of truth, but we shouldn't assume that things are simple or cut and dry. That answer is not an answer meant to say that what is the right solution for Uyghur rights in China, nor, for example, for Kashmir between Pakistan and India or independence. That's not for me to say, but what I can say is that morally, Kashmiris have rights. Whatever the end solution is going to be, Uyghurs have rights. Whatever the end solution is going to be, we should advocate for that without allowing, and this is the final point I'll make, but without allowing rights to be instrumentalized for imperial policy. If you look at the history of the imperial encroachment and the colonial encroachment on India, on Africa, and in other part of the world, it's always been in the name of rights, in the name of indigenous rights, in the name of minority rights, in the name of protection of some vulnerable group, ethnic or religious group, from genocide of another group or of a majority. So we have to be careful to stand up and also not to fall into those instrumentalized forms of religious advocacy. It's a difficult challenge, but there are ways, and maybe if we have time, we can discuss some of those ways in this session or in other sessions.
Thanks, Sayyid.
So the goal is to set the red lines or the parameters and not to give a specific answer there.
I'm going to ask you the third question. Should Shia Muslims always support democracy, or is dictatorship also okay if seen as benevolent? If okay, what about the bad effects of dictatorship over time? That's
a good question. And the previous question, by the way, I forgot one part, which is that Iran advocates for this. As a person of conscience, it's important for us not to be wedded to Iran or Lebanon or Pakistan or India or any country. We judge every non-ma'asum by the standards of the ma'asum. Yes, we are humble because we don't know all of the factors that exist within a country or within a society, especially if it's not our society. So we shouldn't, be quick to express an opinion. But our loyalty is not to an alim. Our loyalty is not to a country. Our loyalty is not even to somebody who is a fellow Shia. Our loyalty is to Allah, the Prophet, and Ma'asumin. They are the perfect standard. So we don't have to automatically assume that everything done by a Shia is right. However, we should be humble and not criticize if we don't have that knowledge. Should we always advocate democracy? Democracy, as you've seen in the implementation, does not always lead to the best result. It can lead to demagoguery. It can lead to people who will undermine democracy after an election. And this has happened in the United States, in India, and in other societies. Perhaps people could give the example of Brazil from various religions and backgrounds. In Islam, however, even if there are these harms of democracy, what we find from the Sunnah of the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt alayhimussalam is that they put their message to the people. And if the people make a bad choice, democratically or through their processes of decision making, then we want to raise the ability of people to make good decisions. So this is why we find that Imam Ali alayhi salam, he didn't impose things on the people of Iraq and the people who were under his command. He argued with them. If it had been anyone else, they would have said, this is right, this is the Sunnah, I'm going to force you to do it. And this was done by some of the previous caliphs and the later rulers of the Muslim Ummah. But Imam Ali was trying to change the conscience of people. Because even though democracy or popular engagement sometimes leads to bad decisions, that is the only sustainable means of ensuring what is good for society. And so the need then is to raise the level of human awareness. So in our own time, democracies will always be not just a theory, but they will be an actual system, a federal system, a parliamentary system, a first past the post presidential system. I mean, when we speak of democracy, we're not speaking of a theory, we're speaking of these actual systems that are in place in society that are hard to change because they have inertia. And sometimes it might be hypothetically the case that a nominal democracy is actually less responsive to people's needs than a nominal non-democracy. Our goal is that we should try to examine our context and see how we can best advocate for the greatest justice in a sustainable manner. The sustainable part is important because it will bring people's participation to the forefront. Sustainable change can only exist when people's hearts and people's priorities are changed. But don't be fooled by the label. A nominal democracy is not necessarily going to represent the will of the people. And in any context, look for those priorities and principles that Islam gives us, see how you can best advocate for them. The hard part is to say, you know, this is better for people's economic interests. This is perhaps going to cause harm for economic interests, but it might be good for the long-term sovereignty of society. And it's not, you know, what is right or wrong that's a hard decision, but what is more important. And in making that decision of what is a higher priority, we need the attribute of open communication with other members of society and stakeholders so that it can become a decision made not just on the basis of what I think is right, but on the basis of what consensus can develop within society at the current time. So that's a general answer. But in just one sentence, I'll give a priority in general in Islam. The message of Islam itself, the message of the Prophet and the Imams was given to the Ummah. So we should always prioritize empowering people and engaging people and trust that that is the way to get long-term change to the extent possible.
Thank you, Agha. This brings to our fourth and the last question. What does Islam say about the army's role in government? Should Shias in Pakistan join the ongoing movement against the army's involvement in civilian matters?
So again, to speak to a specific incident in Pakistan is difficult to address from this platform and also with my limited knowledge, but I can speak of a few general principles. Sunni Islam historically has often been over-militarized, partially because of the importance of stability within their conception of the role of government and the importance of the conquests in their understanding of the function of government. So this is the reality in a Sunni majority country that is often likely to be the case. Just like China has historically for hundreds and thousands of years had a strong bureaucracy, Sunni Islam has been animated by the centrality of military considerations or military leadership. It was often the contender with the strongest army who won the kingship or the caliphate when there was civil war. So our job in Pakistan or in any country is to look at the reality of our society, the strength of civilian institutions, the institutions that have the ability to prevent a breakdown of society, a loss of sovereignty, and then see how much support or opposition we are to give to each of those institutions to preserve those higher goals. Even within a single society like Pakistan, at different times, depending on how serious or how immediate the threat of war is, the level of pressure that we may exert on a particular institution may change. And that applies equally to America. So recognize that a Sunni society is often more militarized just by its conception of Islam and its nature than a Shia society. And in another way to put that, a Sunni conception of Islam often places a higher priority on stability and pragmatism than a Shia society, which in our language, in our commemoration of Karbala, places a higher premium on social solidarity and justice. These are differences that come from our culture and from our history and some of our values. So we have to recognize that reality when we're dealing with a society informed by those principles. Just like for Americans, the Constitution is a special document. Regardless of whether I like the Constitution, I don't like the Constitution, but it's a historical reality. It's a valuable document to the people of this country, and I have to recognize that. Regardless of whether I believe in the Second Amendment or not, I can't disregard the history of that document in this society. So when it comes to any Sunni society or government, recognize the importance of that institution within the conception of that community, and then find ways to exert pressure on all of the influential institutions within society, civilian and non-civilian, and in some cases NGOs, in such a way to strengthen those foundational priorities of Islam that we spoke about earlier. And be sensitive to the fact that an election year might require different action than a non-election year. A time when society is gripped by a political threat or a military threat may require a different response than a different time. So don't be wedded to a single slogan or a single strategy. Be receptive and adaptive to different contexts. I hope that answer is not too general to be useful, but of course, the experiences and the expertise of many different members of society are always needed to get a more specific answer. And that is part of the message that I hope to impart today.
Well, that concludes our Q&A session. I would really like to thank Sayyid for sharing his wisdom with us. We are really blessed to have you as part of our community. Next, I would like to ask Brother Ali Abbas, and he will recite a ziyarah.
Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah. Assalamu alayka ya ibn Rasulillah. Assalamu alayka ya ibn Amir al-Mu'mineen wa ibn Sayyid al-Wasiyyin. السلام عليك يا ابن فاطمة الزهراء سيدة النساء العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا مولانا يا غريب الغرباء. السلام عليك يا معين الضعفاء والفقراء. السلام عليك يا شمس الشموس يا أنيس النفوس أيها المدفون بأرض طوس يا سلطان العرب والعجم يا علي بن موسى الرضا الراضي بالقدر والقضاء ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا صاحب العصر والأمر والزمان. السلام عليك يا خليفة الرحمن. السلام عليك يا إمام الإنس والجان. الأمان 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 من فتنة الزمان. عجل الله تعالى فرجك وسهل الله تعالى مخرجك وجعلنا من أنصارك وأعوانك ورحمة الله وبركاته. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
اللهم صل على
السلام عليك يا حجة الله في أرضه. السلام عليك يا عين الله في خلقه. السلام عليك يا نور الله الذي يهتدي به المهتدون ويفرج به عن المؤمنين. السلام عليك أيها المهذب الخائف. السلام عليك أيها الغني الواسع. السلام عليك أيها المهذب الخائف. السلام عليك أيها الغني الواسع. السلام عليك يا سفينة النجاة. السلام عليك يا أين الحياة يا أين السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي علت بفنائك. عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار. ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب المسنى